What would you do if you accidentally found an old bank account you opened over a decade ago? And inside it sat $24 million you never put there. Now imagine making one phone call to figure out who had been quietly depositing into that account for years. And the answer turns out to be someone who shared your bed, your home, and your life for 15 years. This isn't fiction. This is exactly what happened to me. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why I never once doubted what I had to do next. My name is Helen. I'm 46 years old, and for most of my life, I was the kind of woman things simply didn't happen to. I was the one who made things happen. I paid bills on time. I kept a shared calendar. I remembered birthdays, dentist appointments, when the furnace filter needed changing. I had a color-coded spreadsheet for the grocery budget, and still found time to bake on Sunday mornings. My life was steady, organized, a little unglamorous, but it was mine. I live in a quiet 3-bedroom house just outside Chicago. I'm a senior accountant at a mid-sized logistics firm. I have 2 kids, my son Ethan, 22, finishing grad school in Michigan, and my daughter Olivia, 19, studying nursing in Indianapolis. I raised them mostly on my own after the divorce. There's always a divorce when a story starts this way, isn't there? For years, I told myself I was fine. And maybe I was, in the way a person is fine when they've simply gotten used to a certain amount of background grief. The kind you don't talk about at work. The kind you bury under coffee and routines and busy mornings. But about a year before everything changed, I started noticing small things. Nothing dramatic. Just little splinters under the surface. A mutual acquaintance mentioned, almost in passing, that my ex-husband Mark had recently bought a vacation home in Scottsdale, Arizona. I smiled and said something neutral. But I remember driving home afterward with a strange, cold feeling crawling up the back of my neck. Mark was a sales consultant. A decent one. But not Scottsdale vacation home decent. Not when he'd told our divorce mediator, 10 years earlier, that he had no significant liquid assets. 2 months later, Ethan mentioned during a phone call that he'd run into his father at a restaurant in Chicago. He didn't say much. He and his dad had always had a distant, polite relationship. But he mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Mark had been wearing a watch Ethan described as insanely expensive. I let it go. I told myself people's circumstances change. I told myself it wasn't my business anymore. But it nagged at me. The way things nag when they just don't add up. It was a gray Wednesday in October when everything began. I was working from home, finally tackling a backlog of old financial documents I'd been meaning to organize for years. Old tax files, receipts, the kind of paperwork that piles up in a shoebox and never quite makes it to the shredder. Somewhere in the third box, between a 2009 car insurance renewal and a birthday card from my mother, I found an old envelope from a bank called First Meridian Financial. I almost threw it away without opening it. I didn't even recognize the name. First Meridian had since been absorbed by a larger bank. But something made me stop. My name was on the envelope. My full legal name, Helen Marie Carter. I opened it. It was an annual account summary, dated 2014. I didn't remember opening an account with First Meridian. The balance listed was $847.32. Unremarkable. Forgettable. I set it aside. But that night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Because I did not remember opening that account. And I had been a meticulous record keeper my entire adult life. I would have remembered that if only I had known, in that moment, just how far down this rabbit hole truly went. But that night, all I had was an itch I couldn't scratch. The next morning, I searched online and discovered First Meridian had been absorbed by a larger bank, Heritage Federal. I called their customer service line during my lunch break. Gave my name, my social security number, my old address. There was a pause on the line. Then the representative said carefully, "Ms. Carter, I'm showing a linked account in your name that's been active. Would you like me to confirm the current balance?" "Yes," I said. "Please." Another pause. "The current balance," she said, "is $24,312,000. I sat down. I was already sitting, but somehow I sat down harder, like my body needed to physically reconnect with the ground beneath me. Outside my window, a neighbor was raking leaves. The world was perfectly, absurdly ordinary. except for the number still ringing in my ears. $24 million. In an account with my name on it. That I did not open. I called the bank back 20 minutes later, just to make sure I hadn't misheard. I didn't sleep that night. Not a single hour. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling while the radiator clicked and the street outside went quiet, running the same thoughts in circles. The way your brain does when it refuses to let go of a thread. $24 million. My name. An account I hadn't opened. Or had I? Could I have simply forgotten? No. I was an accountant. I tracked every account I'd ever held in a master document. Had done it since I was 23 years old. There was no version of events where I'd opened an account with $800, forgotten about it, and somehow never noticed it grow into $24 million. So someone else had opened it. In my name. That thought is what finally made me sit up at 3 a.m, turn on the lamp, and just breathe for a moment in the yellow light. Because I knew. Not yet with proof, but with the deep cellular certainty of a woman who had spent 10 years quietly wondering why her divorce settlement had always felt strangely hollow. I knew exactly who it was. Let me tell you something about my marriage that I didn't fully understand while I was living inside it. Mark was a charming man. The kind who made everyone in a room feel noticed. He remembered your drink order, your kid's soccer schedule, the name of your elderly dog. He was warm, funny, effortlessly social. For a long time, I mistook that for goodness. It wasn't goodness. It was a skill. And underneath that skill was a very different kind of man, one with a practiced, profound talent for making things appear to be something other than what they actually were. Our divorce in 2014 had been my decision. After 2 years of emotional distance so complete it felt like living with a polite stranger, I'd finally pulled the pin. We went through mediation. Mark presented financial documents. I reviewed them myself, professionally, carefully. And the picture they painted was of a man of modest means, some shared debt, and no significant assets beyond our joint property. We sold the house. Divided the proceeds. I walked away with enough for a smaller home and a settlement that covered the kids' basic needs. I went back to full-time work. I rebuilt. And now, 10 years later, I was sitting in my bedroom at 3 a.m, wondering if the entire financial picture he'd presented had been a lie from the very beginning. The next day, I took a personal day and drove to the local branch of Heritage Federal. I brought my passport, my social security card, and the old First Meridian envelope. The branch manager, a careful woman in her 50s named Diane, confirmed the account had been opened in 2012, 2 years before my divorce, using my full name and social security number. The initial deposit had been $847. Over the following 2 years, the account had received a series of wire transfers totaling nearly $24 million. After 2014, no further activity. The account had simply sat there, waiting. Who made those transfers? I asked. Diane looked at her screen for a long moment. I can see the originating account numbers, she said carefully. But I can't share that information today. You'd need to go through our legal compliance department, or submit a formal records request. I thanked her and walked out into the parking lot. The wind off the lake was sharp and cold. I sat in my car, pressed my hands flat against the steering wheel, and let myself feel it. Fear. Real physical fear. The kind that sits in your chest like a stone. Because if I was right, this wasn't just about a bad ex-husband. This was someone who had hidden $24 million using my identity, during our marriage, who had clearly intended to retrieve it later, and who had somehow never gotten around to it, or never been able to, or simply forgotten the account existed at all. The same way he'd apparently forgotten that I was still its legal owner. But here was the thing about fear. I had felt it before. I'd felt it filing for divorce. I'd felt it walking into my first day back at full-time work as a single parent. I'd felt it signing school forms alone, trying not to show my kids how exhausted I really was. Fear was not new to me. Fear was something I had considerable experience managing. So I sat in that parking lot, and I let myself be afraid for exactly 15 minutes. I watched the clock on my dashboard. And when the 15 minutes were up, I started thinking. First, I would say nothing to Mark or anyone in his orbit. My first instinct had been to confront him. I recognized that instinct as the worst possible move. If he didn't know I'd found the account, and the bank's silence over the years suggested he might not, then I had an enormous advantage. I wasn't going to give that up. Second, I needed a lawyer. Not a general family attorney. A forensic financial attorney. Someone who specialized in asset concealment and divorce fraud. Third, documentation. Everything. The old divorce papers, Mark's 2014 financial disclosures, the wire transfer records once I could legally obtain them, a timeline so tight no one could argue with it. That night, I opened my laptop and created a new folder. I gave it a boring name, Home Maintenance 2024. And inside it, I began to build my case. The attorney I found was Diane Okoye. 20 years of experience in financial litigation. A specialty in post-divorce asset recovery. An office on Michigan Avenue that looked expensive in the quiet, precise way, not flashy, just the kind of place where things got done. A colleague who'd gone through a complicated divorce years earlier described her as the most prepared person I've ever watched work. That was exactly what I needed. I called her Thursday morning. By Friday afternoon, I was sitting across from her, sliding a manila folder across her desk. The first Meridian envelope, my notes from the bank visit, my original divorce settlement, and a 3-page timeline I'd assembled the night before. She read everything without a word. When she finished, she set the papers down and folded her hands. "Miss Carter," she said, "if the wire transfer records show what I think they're going to show, this may be one of the cleanest cases of marital asset concealment I've seen in a long time. Is it even recoverable? After 10 years? Illinois has no statute of limitations on divorce fraud when the concealment was active and deliberate," she said. 10 years doesn't protect him. It just means we have more documentation to gather. She paused. "Are you prepared for this to become adversarial? Once we file the formal records request and begin subpoenas, Mr. Carter will find out." I had thought about almost nothing else for the past 3 days. "Yes," I said. "I'm prepared." Diane filed the legal records request the following week. I went back to my routine, work, home, calls with the kids, Sunday coffee, and tried to look like a woman whose life was perfectly ordinary. I'd had years of practice at that. About 3 weeks into the wait, I noticed the first sign something had shifted on Mark's end. Ethan called on a Tuesday evening and carefully, the way he always navigated between his parents, mentioned that his father had called him out of the blue that weekend, asking about me. "Kind of weird," Ethan said. "Like asking if you'd mentioned anything lately. If anything had changed." I kept my voice neutral. "What did you tell him?" "That you seemed fine. Same as always." He paused. "Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine, sweetheart." I hung up and stood in my kitchen for a long moment. Mark was asking about me, after years of near silence. The timing wasn't a coincidence. Either he'd been tipped off, or he'd had some reason to check on the account recently, and noticed the legal request attached to it. Either way, he knew something was moving, which meant I had less time than I'd hoped. I called Diane the next morning. The bank had received the subpoena. She expected the transfer records within 2 to 3 weeks. "We're close," she said. We were close. So was he. The documents arrived on a gray Tuesday morning. Diane called within the hour. I drove downtown, and she walked me through what the bank records showed with the calm precision of a surgeon. The account had been opened in 2012 using my full name, my social security number, my date of birth, and a forged signature on the application. A signature Diane had already had compared by the bank's compliance team to my real one. Inconsistent. The initial $847 deposit had been made in cash. Over the following 22 months, 17 wire transfers had come in from 3 different Delaware LLCs, names like Heritage Consulting Group and Lakeshore Ventures. Diane had already pulled the incorporation records. All 3 companies had Mark listed as sole managing member. $24 million. Moved into an account in my name, without my knowledge, during our marriage. I looked at the documents for a long time. Something settled in my chest. Not calm exactly. More like the particular stillness that comes after a long uncertainty finally ends. And you know, fully irreversibly, that you were right. "Is this enough?" I asked. "This," Diane said, sliding the folder back across the desk, "is more than enough. I signed the authorization to proceed with full litigation. As I wrote my name, my real name, in my real handwriting, I thought about the forged signature on that 2012 application. Someone had sat down and carefully copied the shape of my name, practiced it, used it to build a financial fortress they planned to walk into one day, leaving me with nothing. I pressed the pen down a little harder. There was no going back now. And I didn't want to go back. Not even a little. Diane moved fast. Within 2 weeks, she'd filed a motion to freeze the account pending litigation, submitted the forensic evidence package to the court, and notified Mark's attorney, a man named Russell Hale, described by Diane simply as someone who prefers settlements to courtrooms, that we were proceeding. I went back to my life. And waited. I told myself I was ready. I was not entirely ready for what happened next. It was a Thursday evening, 6 days after Diane had notified Russell Hale. I was making pasta in the kitchen, news playing low in the background, when my phone rang. Mark's name on the screen. I hadn't spoken to him directly in almost 3 years. I let it ring twice. Then picked up. Helen. His voice was exactly as I remembered, warm, unhurried. The voice of a man who'd never felt urgency, because he'd never needed to. We should talk. You can call Diane Okoye. She's my attorney of record. Everything goes through her. I'd rather talk to you directly. A pause. This doesn't have to be what you're making it. I'm not making it anything, I said. The documents are making it. A longer silence. And then the warmth dropped out of his voice like a switch being thrown. You need to think very carefully about what you're doing, he said. I have documentation that shows you knew about those accounts. That you agreed to the arrangement. That this was mutual. My hand tightened on the phone. That's not true. It doesn't matter if it's true, he said. It matters how it looks. And Helen, I have people who will say what I need them to say. You know that about me. I did know that about him. It was perhaps the most honest thing he'd said to me in 20 years. Good night, Mark, I said and hung up. I stood there for a moment, pasta boiling behind me, letting the full weight of what he'd just implied settle over me. He had fabricated evidence, or was prepared to. He had attorneys, former colleagues, possibly people whose names I'd known throughout our marriage, willing to lie under oath. He was not going to simply let this go. 2 days later, it got worse. I came home from work to find a white Range Rover in my driveway, Tiffany's, Mark's wife. She was standing on my porch when I pulled in. 38, blonde, impeccably dressed, with the kind of confidence that comes not from competence, but from never having faced consequences. She smiled at me as I got out of the car. The kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. Helen, she said. I thought we could have a woman-to-woman conversation. I stopped at the bottom of my porch steps. You shouldn't be here. I just want to talk. She tilted her head. Mark is very upset. This whole thing, it's hurting the family. It's hurting your kids, Ethan and Olivia. Do not say my children's names, I said very quietly. She kept going, undeterred. Mark has documented proof that you knew about the financial arrangements during the marriage. If this goes to court, it's your word against his. And you know Mark, he's well regarded. He has a lot of friends. A lot of people who trust him. She paused. I'm asking you, woman to woman, to think about what a long, ugly court case does to your reputation, your career, your kids' lives. It was a threat dressed up as concern. I'd learned to recognize that costume during 15 years of marriage. You need to leave my property, I said. Now. Her smile didn't waver, but something behind her eyes did. She left. I called Diane and relayed everything, Mark's call, Tiffany's visit, the implication of fabricated testimony. Write it all down, time-stamped, email it to me immediately, Diane said. What he said about manufacturing evidence, that's potentially obstruction. I documented everything. What followed over the next week was a controlled, professional form of combat. Mark's attorney filed 2 motions to delay the account freeze. Both were denied. He submitted a character statement from a former business associate of Mark's, claiming I'd been aware of offshore arrangements during our marriage. Diane shredded it. The associate turned out to be a co-owner of one of Mark's Delaware LLCs, with a direct financial stake in the outcome. A second statement, from a different associate, met the same fate. The court upheld the freeze. After that, the calls and the pressure stopped abruptly. The way pressure sometimes stops, not because anything's resolved, but because the other side is regrouping. I took those 2 weeks to do almost nothing. I drove to the Indiana dunes alone and walked the shoreline for 2 hours. The fight wasn't over. I knew that perfectly well. But the account was frozen, the evidence was with the court, and sometimes, between battles, you're allowed to just breathe. The offer came through Russell Hale, formally, in writing, on a Monday morning. Diane forwarded it with a single line. Call me when you've read this. I read it twice. Mark was proposing a private settlement. He'd acknowledge administrative irregularities in the account's creation. In exchange, I'd receive $4 million, a clean wire transfer, no complications. Both parties sign a mutual non-disclosure agreement, all litigation withdrawn. The remaining $20 million would revert to his control. $4 million. Enough to sound generous. Enough to make a tired, middle-aged woman think about paying off her mortgage, funding her kids' futures, never worrying about a car repair again. He'd calculated it precisely. He knew my finances. He probably knew, to the dollar, exactly what $4 million would mean to the life I'd been living for the last decade. I called Diane. What do you think? I asked, though I already knew. That's your decision, she said carefully. But professionally, his willingness to offer $4 million before discovery even starts tells me he's frightened. A confident man doesn't offer $4 million to make a problem disappear. He's frightened, I repeated. I believe so. I was quiet for a moment. Outside my office window, Chicago went about its business. I let myself think about $4 million honestly, without guilt. Paying off the house. Olivia finishing nursing school debt-free. Ethan's face. And then I thought about the forged signature. The 17 wire transfers. The mediation room where Mark had sat across from me, calm and warm, and told a mediator he had no significant assets. I thought about the last 10 years, the life I'd built alone on a salary, while $24 million sat in an account with my name on it. Tell him no, I said. Without anger. Without drama. The way you say something when you've already been certain for a long time, and you're just now putting the words in the air. Understood, Diane said. I'll respond today. What followed was a strange, suspended 2 weeks, a Cold War. Mark and Tiffany went quiet. No calls, no visits, no motions. Diane confirmed Russell Hale had received our rejection, and that his client was considering options. The person who got me through that period was Carolyn. Carolyn Reyes had been my closest friend since we'd met at a parent-teacher night back in 2008. 2 exhausted mothers in plastic chairs, sharing a look that somehow turned into 16 years of friendship. She was a paralegal, divorced herself, with a dry humor and zero ability to sugarcoat anything. I'd finally told her everything the week before, over wine at her kitchen table. She'd listened without interrupting. Then she said, "You know what infuriates me most? He didn't even bother to use a different name. He used yours. He was that confident you'd never find it." That observation had lodged itself in me and never left. One evening during that quiet stretch, I asked her if she thought I was doing the right thing. She set down her coffee cup. "Helen, he used your name, your social security number, and a forged signature to hide $24 million, while sitting across from you in a mediator's office telling them he had nothing. The right thing isn't even a question here." She paused. "The only question is whether you're going to stay steady when he makes his next move. And he will make a next move. People like Mark always do." She was right. I knew she was right. The call came on a Sunday. Mark's voice was different this time. Quieter. Something in it I recognized from the early years of our marriage. Something he deployed carefully, and rarely. The sound of a man performing humility. "Helen, I want to apologize. What happened with Tiffany, that was wrong. I should have stopped her. I'm calling because I think this has gotten out of hand, and I'd like to talk. Just the 2 of us. Civilly." I'd been expecting this. The pressure had failed. The cash offer had failed. What came next in Mark's playbook, I knew, was the warm approach. The extended hand. The apparent step back. "We can meet," I said. With both our attorneys present. I was thinking more informal. Coffee maybe, just to clear the air. Attorneys present, I repeated. Or we don't meet. A pause. All right, he said. That works. We met 4 days later in a conference room at Diane's office. Diane, myself, Russell Hale, and Mark. Tiffany wasn't there. Her absence felt deliberate, like she'd been judged too volatile to risk bringing. Mark had dressed carefully. Dark gray understated. The costume of a reasonable man. He smiled at me when I walked in. The smile I remembered from the good years. Warm. Slightly self-deprecating. The smile of a man who made you feel like he was on your side. For about 10 minutes, he talked about regret. He said the financial decisions he'd made during our marriage had been wrong. That he'd been under enormous pressure from business partners. That he'd always intended, and here he paused carefully, to properly account for everything. He said the account had been opened with my information because his business associates had required a domestic account holder, and he'd believed at the time he'd be able to explain it all to me eventually. It was a masterful performance. He didn't admit fraud. He admitted poor judgment, poor communication. A flawed but not criminal man, overwhelmed by circumstances, who'd made mistakes but never intended harm. I watched Diane's face, unmoved. Russell Hale then presented a revised and improved settlement, $6 million this time. Same NDA. Same return of the remaining funds to Mark. I looked at the document. Then I looked at Mark, and I asked very quietly, if the money was always intended to be disclosed eventually, why did you forge my signature on the account application? The warmth in his face didn't exactly vanish. It recalibrated. Something behind his eyes went flat. He looked at Russell Hale, who started saying something about the signature analysis being preliminary and contested. But I kept my eyes on Mark. You sat in a mediator's office in 2014, I said, and told them you had no significant liquid assets. There are 17 wire transfers that say otherwise. There's a forged signature that says otherwise. I've been an accountant for 23 years. I understand exactly what this documentation means. Silence in the room. Then something happened that I think Mark hadn't planned for, and couldn't control. His composure broke. Not completely. Not theatrically. But in the particular way a facade breaks when its structural support finally gives out. His jaw tightened. His voice dropped. You have no idea, he said. What you're starting. You think you're the only one who can make things difficult. I built things during our marriage that you benefited from. I kept this family in a certain kind of life. And you. He stopped himself. Pressed his lips together. Looked at the table. Mark. Russell Hale's voice was careful, almost alarmed. But the mask had slipped. For about 10 seconds in that conference room, I saw the actual man underneath the warmth, the gray suit, the performed regret. He wasn't frightened the way weak people are frightened. He was frightened the way powerful people are frightened. When they suddenly realize the ground beneath them is moving. I stood up. We're done for today, I said to Diane. She nodded and started gathering papers. I walked out of that building and stood on Michigan Avenue in the cold. And I felt it. Real fear. Specific fear. Because for those 10 seconds, I'd seen that Mark's anger wasn't bluster. He was the kind of man who followed through. He'd proven that quietly for 15 years. And now he was frightened, which made him more dangerous, not less. But here's what else I felt. Standing on that street. The fear was clarifying. It swept away the last traces of ambivalence. The last ghost of the woman who'd once loved him and occasionally wondered if she was overreacting. There was no ambivalence left. Just a clear, cold line between where I was standing and where I needed to go. I texted Carolyn. He showed his face today. All the way in. No going back. Her reply came back in 30 seconds. Good. Now finish it. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in early December. A case management conference before Judge Patricia Harmon. The first formal proceeding where both sides would present their positions on whether the funds in that account constituted concealed marital assets. Diane had told me what to expect. Mark's side would argue 3 things simultaneously. That I'd known about the account, that I hadn't known but had acquiesced to it, and that the account was a business instrument, not a marital asset. Those three arguments are incompatible, Diane said. We let them make all three, and watch the structure collapse. I wore a dark blue suit. Carolyn texted me a photo that morning, a chess queen. No caption. The courtroom was nothing like the movies. Fluorescent lights, beige walls, a slightly crooked flag beside the bench. Judge Harmon was compact, early 60s, close-cropped silver hair, and the specific patience of someone who'd seen every variety of human dishonesty, and was no longer surprised by any of it. Mark sat with Russell Hale, and a second attorney handling financial exhibits. Tiffany sat in the gallery, dressed expensively, sitting with the calculated stillness of someone who'd been told to show no expression. Diane went first. She walked through the chronology with quiet precision. The 2012 account opening, the forged signature, the 17 wire transfers from Mark's Delaware LLCs, and the 2014 mediation in which Mark had certified, under penalty of perjury, that he held no significant undisclosed assets. Under penalty of perjury, Judge Harmon made a note. Then Russell Hale rose, and the morning began to come apart for Mark's side. He argued I'd known about the account, citing the same compromised business associate statement Diane had already undermined. Judge Harmon asked about that conflict of interest. Hale's answer wasn't strong. He argued the account was a business instrument. Judge Harmon asked how a personal account, opened with my social security number, and bearing my forged signature, qualified as a business instrument rather than a personal one. Hale's response ran 90 seconds and answered nothing. Then he made the argument Diane had predicted, that my decade of non-engagement with the account demonstrated acquiescence. Judge Harmon looked up. Counsel, your client's position is that Ms. Carter knew about this account, and also that her failure to engage with it indicates acceptance of its structure. Can you help me understand how both can be simultaneously true? Given that the account was opened using a signature your own expert has now partially contested. The room went very quiet. Hale got about 4 sentences into an answer before the younger attorney leaned over and whispered something. He paused, regrouped, started again. Professionally, it was not a graceful moment. Mark, beside him, was doing something I'd never seen him do in 20 years, sitting absolutely still. Mark was a physical communicator. A hand on the arm, a lean forward, a gesture. The stillness meant he was working very hard to contain something. Diane rose for rebuttal. 3 points, 3 sentences. She sat down. After arguments, Judge Harmon ordered a full forensic accounting review of the wire transfer records, authorized expanded subpoenas for the Delaware LLC formation documents, and directed both parties to provide full financial disclosures within 30 days. Then she looked at Russell Hale and said, Counsel, I'll note for the record that the signature analysis and the perjury question on the 2014 disclosure are items this court considers significant. I'd encourage your client to review his options carefully before the next hearing. A judicial understatement so precise it was almost elegant. In the corridor afterward, I passed Mark and Tiffany. He looked, for the first time since I'd known him, like a man genuinely unsure what came next. Tiffany's careful stillness had collapsed into something taut and unhappy. She said something to him in a low voice I didn't catch. He didn't respond. I walked out into the December cold. Diane fell into step beside me. That went well, she said. Yes, I said. It did. I felt something different from before. Not fear, not even relief exactly. More like the particular silence after a very loud sound. The hearing hadn't been the end. But it was the moment the outcome became, if not certain, then legible. You could see the shape of it now. The way you can sometimes see the shape of land before you finish crossing it. I called Carolyn from the parking garage. She picked up on the first ring. How'd it go? He couldn't hold all 3 arguments at once, I said. She laughed short, satisfied. Of course he couldn't. He's not actually that smart. He just played a long game with someone who wasn't watching. I'm watching now, I said. I know, she said. I've known that for a while. The next 4 months were, in the language of litigation, a slow unwinding. The expanded subpoenas produced exactly what Diane had suspected. The 3 Delaware LLCs, plus a third entity neither of us had known about, had a combined financial history that, once mapped chronologically, told a clear and damning story. That third company had received contracts during our marriage from businesses Mark had claimed, in his 2014 disclosure, to have no ongoing relationship with. The LLCs had funneled income through multiple layers before final deposits landed in the Heritage Federal account. Not technically simple, but not impenetrable either. Once Diane's forensic accountant finished mapping it, the picture was unmistakable. Mark had been concealing income through a corporate layering scheme for at least 7 years before our divorce. The account in my name had been the final repository, a safe harbor he'd intended to access once the divorce was final and the dust had settled. He hadn't accessed it because, Diane's theory went, his business circumstances had changed unexpectedly in 2015. One of his entities had been named in a separate civil dispute, and rather than risk scrutiny of a large unexplained transfer, he'd left the account dormant. And then time passed. The urgency faded. The account simply sat there, growing a small amount of interest, attached to my name. Waiting. In March, Judge Harmon issued her ruling. She found that the funds in the account constituted marital assets that had been actively and deliberately concealed by Mark during our 2014 dissolution proceedings, that his financial certification had been materially false, and that the full balance, plus applicable interest, was to be distributed to me as the equitable settlement. She referred the matter of the falsified certification to the state's attorney's office for review. That wasn't something Diane had even asked for. The judge had done it on her own assessment of the record. She also awarded attorney's fees, not a given in Illinois civil cases. It was a signal. The final number transferred to me, after legal fees and procedural costs, was $22,700,000. I was sitting in Diane's conference room when the wire confirmation came through. She turned her laptop screen toward me. "It's real," she said simply. I nodded. I want to be honest about what that moment felt like because I think people expect it to feel like a movie, a crescendo, the light changing. It didn't. It felt very quiet, very still, very tired in the good way. The way your body feels at the end of a long hike, when you've reached the place you were going, and you can finally stop walking. I'd been walking for a long time. The walking was done. Mark didn't fight the ruling. I was told Russell Hale had advised him very strongly against it, given the state's attorney referral hanging over everything. He signed the transfer authorization without comment. I don't know what that felt like for him. And somewhat to my own surprise, I found I didn't particularly want to know. What I did, the afternoon the transfer was confirmed, was drive to Carolyn's house. I let myself in with the key she'd given me years ago, found her in her kitchen making tea, and told her the final number. She set down her mug, looked at me for a long moment. $22,700,000, she repeated. Yes. She sat down across from me. For about 30 seconds, neither of us said anything. Then she reached across the table and took my hand. "Helen," she said. "You did it." I had done it. Not with drama. Not with a speech, or a confrontation in a hallway, or any of the clean cinematic moments I'd half imagined at 3 in the morning. I'd done it the way I'd done most things in my life, with documents, preparation, and the refusal to be moved by pressure, money, or the performed warmth of a man who'd counted on me not looking closely enough. He'd been wrong about that. He'd been wrong about me from the beginning. I didn't do anything extravagant right away. The first thing I did was pay off my house. I drove to the bank, processed the payoff, and sat in the parking lot holding the confirmation paperwork. That house had been the one solid thing in my life for 10 years. Now it was fully mine. The second thing I did was set up educational trusts for Ethan and Olivia, enough to erase their student loans, fund graduate studies, and give them a foundation they'd never have to worry about. I called each of them separately and told them there'd been a legal settlement, and their financial futures were secure. Ethan went quiet for a long moment, then said, "Mom, are you okay?" I told him I was better than I'd been in years. Olivia cried a little, which made me cry, and then we both laughed. The third thing I did was pay off the last 3 years of Carolyn's mortgage. I didn't tell her in advance. I just processed it and called to say it was done. "Helen, you can't." "It's done," I said. "Don't argue with me about it." She didn't argue. She cried instead, which was so unlike her that it made me cry again for the second time that week. I was doing a lot of crying that month. I decided that was acceptable. I left my firm in the spring, gave full notice, finished everything in progress, left on good terms. I took 3 months off and did almost nothing. I walked. I read. I drove to the Indiana dunes twice more. I visited each of my kids and stayed for long weekends. Dinners, conversations, the particular luxury of being fully present without the low hum of financial anxiety that had followed me like tinnitus for a decade. In the fall, I started a small consulting practice, helping individuals navigate divorce and asset division, the kind of careful, documentation-focused work I was already good at, now done entirely on my own terms. As for Mark, the state's attorney review resulted in a criminal perjury charge for his 2014 certification. He pleaded guilty to a reduced charge, 2 years probation, a substantial fine, a permanent mark on his professional record. He lost 2 consulting contracts after the case got local coverage. His reputation, his most carefully maintained asset, never fully recovered. Tiffany filed for divorce from him 14 months after the ruling. I don't know the details. I didn't look for them. Whatever happened between them wasn't my story anymore. The Scottsdale house was sold as part of his financial restructuring. I heard, through Ethan, that Mark had moved to a small apartment in the suburbs. I took that information without comment. I didn't feel satisfaction at his diminishment. What I felt was something closer to distance. The peaceful kind. When something that once had enormous power over your life simply recedes until it no longer takes up space inside you. He had taken 10 years from me. He had taken the settlement I deserved. He had taken the version of the future I might have had. He had not, it turned out, taken everything. I was sitting on my back porch one evening in October, a year almost to the day, after I'd found that envelope in the shoebox, watching the late sun come through the oak tree in my yard. The leaves were turning. The light was gold. My coffee was warm. I had nowhere to be. I thought about the woman who'd made that phone call 12 months earlier. How afraid she'd been. How tired. And how quietly certain, somewhere underneath all of it, that there was something that needed to be faced. I was glad she had faced it. If something in this story moved you, if you've ever quietly carried something heavier than anyone around you realized, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Tell me in the comments what you would have done. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe, because there's another waiting for you.